Welcome to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the Reverend Michael T. McFarland S.J. Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. I only say that whole long thing one time a semester. So the McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, discussions, other programs that explore questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. The center also leads an initiative on global Catholicism called Catholics and Cultures, which explores diverse and little-known ways that people around the world live out and practice their faith in particular cultural contexts. We've packed our spring schedule with some great speakers and topics, and I encourage you to visit our website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center to find out more about them and see what else interests you. Today's lecture is one of the Deichmann Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, a series that looks at the place of religious and spiritual life in a world that's sometimes at odds with faith, other times in search of it, and always at work reshaping it. Special thanks to the Deichmann family for funding that and making that possible, and also to my colleague, Professor Matt Eggemeyer, for suggesting this and helping this to come to be today. We're recording today's talk, as we do with many of them. They'll be available for a number of classes on Moodle, and in a few days for public viewing on our website. You get the best part because you're here live, but if you have friends who you can tell them later, they can see it on the website. Does religion promote violence? We're grateful to have William Cavanaugh from DePaul University here today to help us think more deeply about what counts as religious and about the rationality behind it. Bill Cavanaugh is Professor of Catholic Studies and the Director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University in Chicago. That center focuses on theological issues and the encounters between the global South and the North. Bill's scholarship focuses on political theology, economic ethics, and ecclesiology. He's author of 6 books, including The Myth of Religious Violence, Secular Ideology, and the Roots of Modern Conflict, Migrations of the Holy, Theologies of the State and Church, which won first place in the Social Concerns category for the Catholic Press Association Book Awards, Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire, and his newest title, which just came out, we both have just gotten our copies, and that's Field Hospital, the Church's Engagement with a Wounded World. Prior to teaching, Bill was a lay associate with the Holy Cross Order in a poor area of Santiago, Chile, and worked with the Center on Civil Rights and Human Rights in the Notre Dame Law School. We're really delighted to have him here at Holy Cross, so please join me in welcoming Bill Cavanaugh.
Thanks, Tom, for that kind introduction, and thanks for the hospitality to Tom and Matt Eggemeyer, Peter Fritz, Pat Hinchliff, and everybody that's made this visit possible. I'm really delighted that you invited me to come this winter as opposed to last winter. I think that's probably a good idea. I think about Holy Cross a lot because I'm teaching a class on Intro to World Catholicism, and students do presentations from this Catholics and Cultures website as a part of every class period. So it's what you all are doing here is exciting and really interesting. I was out not too long ago walking, and I came upon a very distraught man who was ready to jump off a bridge, and I said, "Wait, don't do it. There's so much to live for. Do you believe in God?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Me too. Are you a Christian or a Jew?" And he said, "I'm a Christian." And I said, "Me too. Protestant or Catholic?" And he said, "Protestant." And I said, "Me too. What kind?" And he said, "Baptist." And I said, "Me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" And he said, "Northern Baptist." And I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist?" And he said, "Northern Conservative Baptist." And I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist New England region?" And he said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region." And I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? And he said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. And I said, "Die, heretic!" And I shoved him off the bridge. Not a true story. That's a joke by Emo Phillips. It was named the funniest religion joke in an online poll. And I think the fact that it was named the funniest religion joke tells you something about the way people think about religion and violence, right? Everybody knows that religion has this tendency to promote violence. When I gave a talk with a similar title at a college that'll remain nameless a while ago, I was on my way to the lecture hall and I saw a poster for the talk, and somebody had scrawled the word "duh" over the poster, and I thought, yeah, that pretty much, that kind of sums it up, right? Everybody knows religion has this dangerous tendency to promote violence. Everybody can cite many examples of this. And some people try to deny this by saying that the violence is really political or really economic and not really religious, but I think that such arguments are easily refuted by the terrorists' own words, and it also assumes a distinction between religious and political and economic factors that ultimately I think is impossible to pull off, and that's part of what I'm going to argue today. And I don't think it works also to claim that the Crusaders were not really Christians, or Islamic terrorists, ISIS is not really Muslims, and so on. I think, on the one hand, normatively, it is important for Christians and Muslims to claim that Crusaders and terrorists have gotten the message of Christianity and Islam all wrong. Descriptively, however, I think it's disingenuous, it's dishonest for Christians and Muslims to absolve their own group from wrongdoing by disowning their bad co-religionists, right? We have to do penance collectively for our collective sins. I learned that as a Catholic, right? The idea that religion promotes violence is part of the conventional wisdom of Western societies, and it affects our domestic policies and laws that keep religion out of the public sphere, and it also affects our foreign policies that seek to promote liberal social orders in other countries by military power if necessary. And this mention of military power for liberal politics indicates that people kill for other things besides religion, and that seems undeniable and obvious too. Behind the common tale of religion and violence, therefore, there has to be a stronger claim, not just that religion promotes violence, but that religion has a greater tendency to promote violence than what is not religion, right? And what is not religion is called secular. So the idea that religion promotes violence depends entirely on this distinction between the religious and the secular. It depends entirely on that distinction between the religious and the secular. So I want you to keep your eye on this distinction as we proceed today. So what I call the myth of religious violence goes like this. Religion is this transhistorical and transcultural, meaning all times, all places, human impulse, that's essentially distinct from secular ideologies and institutions. Religion is more prone to promote violence than secular ideologies and institutions, and therefore religion should be marginalized from public power, and we should fight to defend and spread secular ideals, right? So the myth of religious violence depends entirely on this sharp religious secular distinction as in this table here, right? So keep an eye on this distinction as we go along, because the argument that religion causes violence depends entirely on this. In the religious column are generally included things like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Jainism, Judaism, Hinduism, Confucianism, etc. Under secular, we find non-religious categories of human life like politics and economics, as well as ideologies and practices like nationalism, atheism, Marxism, capitalism, liberalism, etc. That's not religion, right? That's the secular. So the common notion that religion is peculiarly prone to violence depends on the idea that these secular matters have less of a tendency to promote violence, and it's commonly assumed that they do so because they deal with purely mundane affairs, whereas religion, on the other hand, is seen as peculiarly incendiary because it raises the stakes to another level, where reason is trumped by passion. So in academic literature about religion and violence, religion is commonly assumed to be peculiarly absolutist, divisive, irrational, and so on. Now, if we cast a glance over the extraordinarily bloody last 100 years or so, complicating evidence begins to press upon us. World War I, for example, to which nationalism is generally assigned as a primary cause, resulted in 38 million military and civilian casualties. Suppose we ask, who has killed more people over the last 100 years, Muslims or atheists? Well, it's not really even close. The death toll under the three regimes alone of Stalin, Mao, and the Khmer Rouge ranges from a low of 21 million to a high of 70 million, and all were militantly atheists. Deaths under Marxist regimes are estimated in figures that range as high as 110 million. The last 100 years have seen frequent war waged for oil, land, flags, free markets, democracy, ethnicity, a host of other supposedly secular causes. So what becomes of the idea that religion has a peculiar tendency to promote violence in the face of this evidence? Well, for some religion and violence theorists, the answer to this problem is simple. You just move the offending ideologies over to the other side of the table. Atheist Christopher Hitchens takes this approach in his best-selling book, God is Not Great, which is subtitled with typical British understatement, How Religion Poisons Everything. And he says, totalitarianism aims at human perfection, which is essentially a religious impulse, and therefore religion poisons everything because everything poisonous gets identified as religion. And at the same time, everything good ends up on the other side of the religious-secular divide. Hitchens says of Martin Luther King Jr., in no real as opposed to nominal sense was he a Christian, and he bases this remarkable conclusion on the fact that King was nonviolent, and therefore he couldn't possibly be religious because religion is defined as violent. So this is what it looks like then. This is what the distinction looks like for Hitchens then. All of the things that he doesn't like get moved over to the category of religion. And so North Korean and Soviet atheism, Marxism, violent things, etc., they all end up over there. And Hitchens is not alone in this. Once we start examining arguments that religion causes violence, we find that this sort of smoke and mirrors is the norm. The argument that religion has a peculiar disposition toward violence depends upon this sharp dividing line between the religious and the secular, but things are constantly smuggled back and forth across this line. Political theorist Bikku Parekh, for example, issues a blistering indictment of religion. He says it arouses powerful and sometimes irrational impulses and can easily destabilize society, cause political havoc, and create a veritable hell on earth. He goes on to confess, however, that, quote, several secular ideologies, such as some varieties of Marxism, conservatism, and even liberalism, have a quasi-religious orientation and form, and conversely, formally religious languages sometimes have a secular content, so that the dividing line between a secular and a religious language is sometimes difficult to draw. So violent and irrational impulses are popping up everywhere, even in liberalism, which inspires the creation of the category quasi-religious to try to corral them all back onto the religion side of the ledger. So this is what it looks like. Marxism, conservatism, liberalism on the religion and quasi-religion side, and the secular ends up with formally religious languages, which I'm not exactly sure what that means. Consider the case of the preeminent historian Martin Marty. In a book on public religion, Marty argues that religion has a peculiar tendency to be divisive and therefore violent. But Marty lists 17 different definitions of religion, and then he begs off giving his own definition, since he says, quote, scholars will never agree on the definition of religion. And so instead, Marty gives a list of 5 features that mark a religion, which he says is not a definition. He then proceeds to show how politics displays all 5 of the same features. Religion focuses our ultimate concern, and so does politics. Religion builds community, and so does politics. Religion appeals to myth and symbol. Politics mimics this appeal in devotion to the flag, war memorials, and so on down the list. So he offers 5 defining features of religion and shows how politics fits all 5. He's trying to show how closely intertwined religion and politics are, but he ends up demolishing any theoretical basis for separating the two. So what becomes of the religious-secular distinction here? It's not clear. Another example, sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer, whose book Terror in the Mind of God, one of the most widely read academic books on religion and violence, argues that religion exacerbates the tendency to divide people into friends and enemies, good and evil, us and them, by ratcheting divisions up to a cosmic level. But he's forced to admit the difficulty of separating religious violence from secular violence. He writes, secular nationalism, like religion, embraces what one scholar calls a doctrine of destiny. One can take this way of looking at secular nationalism a step further and state flatly that secular nationalism is a religion. Now, that's an important concession, as is his claim that the secular is a sort of advanced form of religion. But if it's true, it subverts the entire basis of his argument. What becomes of the religious-secular divide if the secular is a form of religion? Right? It's just not clear what is left for the other side of the ledger. Now, some religion and violence theorists deal with this problem by openly and consistently expanding the category of religion. So Richard Wentz's book, Why People Do Bad Things in the Name of Religion, includes not only Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and the like, but also consumerism, secular humanism, football fanaticism, faith in technology. He's got this great scene where he describes the guy watching Monday Night Football, and he kind of lets his belly pop open his fly, and he arranges his beer and sandwiches just so, and he describes this all in kind of Eucharistic terms. Faith in technology, a host of other ideologies and practices. Wentz includes those all under the rubric religion, and so he concludes, rather lamely, I think, perhaps all of us do bad things in the name of or as a representative of religion. Now, I think Wentz has intuited correctly that people do violence for all sorts of reasons, right? Where he goes wrong is in thinking that he can obliterate the line between religious and secular and still end up blaming violence on religion. Again, it's just not clear if there's anything left over on the other side of the table. Maybe things that don't matter very much. Everything that people care about gets included under the rubric religion, right? Which is just like saying people kill for things that they care about, which is true but not very interesting. So instead of an argument why religion has a greater tendency than the secular to promote violence, Wentz has simply taken everything that people do violence for and labeled it religion. Wentz is what is called a functionalist, that is, a scholar who believes that religion is whatever functions like one. And there's a vast literature on Marxism as a religion, for example. But you get the idea, right? There's a vast functionalist literature on Marxism as a religion. There's an extensive body of scholarship that explores civil religion in the United States. Robert Bella says civil religion has its own seriousness and integrity and requires the same care and understanding that any other religion does. Carolyn Marvin similarly argues that, quote, nationalism is the most powerful religion in the United States and perhaps in many other countries. Nationalism is the most powerful religion in the United States. She makes a good argument for it. Scholars have explored the peculiar myths and symbols and sacrifices that surround the flag. This was actually how American school children used to salute the American flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance before Hitler made this gesture unpopular in the 1930s, and it was changed to hand over the heart. This was the image that I actually asked Oxford University Press to put on the cover of the book, The Myth of Religious Violence, but they thought it was a little bit too incendiary, I guess. Shocking. More pictures of the same. This is not Nuremberg. This is Dayton, Ohio. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Just had to get one in there. Come on, you miss them. Yeah. This here is what you see if you go into the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. and look up into the dome. This is a painting called The Apotheosis of Washington. Apotheosis, the becoming God of Washington. And it's George Washington ascending to heaven, bodily, being assumed bodily into heaven amongst all of these kind of mythological figures. So more examples of civil religion. In the wake of rolling blackouts in California in 2001, one of the architects of the deregulation of California's electrical utilities that caused all the havoc was quoted in the New York Times expressing his belief that free markets always work better than state control, and he said, "I believe in that premise as a matter of religious faith." And so a scholar who takes a functionalist approach will just take him at his word, right? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? So a survey of religious studies literature finds the following treated under the rubric religion: totems, witchcraft, human rights, Marxism, liberalism, Freudianism, Japanese tea ceremonies, nationalism, sports fanaticism, free market ideology, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the list goes on and on. Alcoholics Anonymous was actually declared a religion by a federal judge in 2002. Now, okay, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, all of these people are just wrong, right? I know what religion is. It's belief in God or gods, right? So just go back to that first slide that you showed about the religious-secular distinction. That's clear enough. Let's just stick with that, right? Okay, well, let's give that a try then. And look at what you find included under religion are some things that are that don't have belief in God or gods as a central concept. Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and so on. So if you follow this idea that religion is belief in God or gods, there are some things that we usually call religions that end up on the secular side. Conversely, okay, then you say, okay, let's come up with a broader definition of religion then and see if we can get Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism and Shinto and so on back over on the other side where we want them on the religious side. So let's try transcendent, right? Now we can move them back over here. Religion is belief in something transcendent, but now nationalism and Marxism and things like that follow us back over to the religious side of the ledger, right? Expand many institutions and ideologies that don't explicitly refer to God or gods function in the same way as those that do. So expanding the concept of religion to include godless Buddhism makes it very hard to exclude godless Marxism, right? And it's hard to imagine a better candidate for transcendence than something like nationalism. The term transcendence is a tool of Western scholars of religion who borrowed it from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and to where you have this distinction between a transcendent God and an immanent order, but there is no such distinction in Buddhism. So in order to use that distinction to include Buddhism, it has to be defined in a very vague manner, and the vaguer it gets, the more it becomes difficult to exclude things like Marxism and nationalism, and the exclusivity of the term religion breaks down very quickly. Now, even if all of that were not the case, and we could find a way to stabilize the categories of religious and secular and get everybody to agree what belongs in each category, would it be any help with the question of violence? Is there any good reason to suppose that people are more likely to kill for a god than for a nation? Right? Try these two questions. What percentage of American Christians would be willing to kill for Jesus? And what percentage of American Christians would be willing to kill for the United States of America? All right? it seems clear, at least among American Christians, that the nation state is subject to far more fervor than Christianity. For the majority of American Christians, even public evangelization is in bad taste, right? When somebody comes knocking at the door, we think, ew, right? But people take it for granted that slaughter on behalf of the nation is sometimes necessary and often laudable. And so I think we have to conclude that there is no coherent way to isolate religious ideologies with a peculiar tendency toward violence from their tamer secular counterparts. So-called secular ideologies and institutions like nationalism and capitalism can inspire just as much violence as so-called religion. And if it seems like this is academic splitting over definitions, it's really nothing more complicated than what the Bible says about idolatry, right? This is the theological implication of everything that I've been saying. And this is just a basic idea from the Bible. People treat all kinds of things, as if they were gods. Golden calves and armies and mammon and even their own bellies, as Paul says to the Philippians. The Bible, of course, teaches that there is one true God among the many false gods, but the Bible doesn't think that there is one set of religious pursuits and another essentially different set of secular pursuits. People in actual fact treat all kinds of things as gods, and so-called religious and secular ideas and practices often function in the same way. Does anybody know what this statue is from? Anybody recognize it? Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that's it's on Wall Street in New York. Anyway, a quote from Pope Francis. Okay, so the myth of religious violence fails because it depends entirely on a stable religious-secular divide that doesn't exist. There is no once-and-for-all definition of religion. Religion is a category constructed in different ways in different places and times, and according to the interests of who's doing the construction. And so to understand why there is so much confusion around the category of religion, I want to briefly examine its history. That's the next part of what I'm going to do. So Charles Kimball's book, When Religion Becomes Evil, begins with the following claim. It is somewhat trite, but nevertheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and these days more evil perpetrated in the name of religion than any other institutional force in human history. Now, if one were to try to prove this claim, you would need a transhistorical and transcultural concept of religion that would be at least theoretically separable from other institutional forces over the course of history, political institutions, for example. The problem is that there was no religion considered as something separable from politics until the modern era, and then primarily in the West. The Romans had the term religio, but there was no religion-politics distinction, right? How could there be when Caesar is a god? Likewise, if you ask the question, is Aztec politics or Aztec religion to blame for their bloody human sacrifices? It's just an anachronism. They just don't have that distinction. As Wilfred Cantwell Smith showed in his landmark 1962 book, The Meaning and End of Religion, religion as a discrete category of human activity separable from culture, politics, etc., is an invention of the modern West. The ancient Romans had the term religio, where we get our term religion, but it covered all kinds of civic duties and relations of respect that we would consider to be secular. So St. Augustine, for example, says, "We have no right to affirm with confidence that religio is confined to the worship of God, since it seems that this word has been detached from its normal meaning, in which it refers to an attitude of respect and relations between a man and his neighbor." Nothing like what we mean by religion, in other words. In the medieval era, the religious-secular distinction was the distinction between two different kinds of Catholic priests, those who belong to an order and those who belong to a diocese. Catholics still refer to joining the Jesuits as entering the religious life, right? Maybe they shouldn't, I don't know, but anyway. In 1400, the religions of England, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary in 1400, the religions of England were the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Benedictines, etc. There was no realm of secular pursuits to which God was indifferent. And though there was a distinction between civil and ecclesiastical authorities, there was no distinction between religion and politics as we know it. This distinction, the religious-secular distinction, was a creation of the early modern struggles for power between ecclesiastical and civil authorities. And this happens between the 15th and the 17th centuries. I'm going to make a very long and complicated story very short here. But religion was invented in this period as an essentially interior private impulse that is essentially separate from political secular concerns. Why? Because that was a way for civil rulers to take what the church did and push it out of the public realm, right? It's basically the result, the religious secular distinction we have is the result of a power struggle in which civil authorities defeated ecclesiastical authorities. So it's just a contingent power arrangement from early modern Europe. It's not just the way things are, but it was subsequently then exported to the non-Western world in the process of colonization. Smith's study concludes, quote, "There is no closely equivalent concept to religion in any culture that has not been influenced by the modern West." He goes looking for it, end quote. He goes looking for it in ancient Greece, China, Egypt, India, and he finds it nowhere. In their initial encounters with the non-Western world, it's interesting, colonizers reported back home to Europe with remarkable consistency that the natives have no religion at all. And I've got a whole list of these in my book. Once they're colonized, though, then the Europeans begin to employ this religious secular distinction because it's useful. Right? Hinduism, let me just give you one example. Hinduism, which is a term that's first used in the 1780s. You've got Hindus before then. You don't have Hinduism until the 1780s. It becomes a religion. It becomes classified as a religion over the course of the 19th century, despite the fact that it encompasses the entire Indian way of life. Everything that we would conclude, or we would divide up into culture, politics, religion, economics, all of that is Hinduism. This is made into a religion by the British. Why? Fritz Stahl concludes, quote, "Hinduism does not merely fail to be a religion, it is not even a meaningful unit of discourse," end quote. Now, that's not an insult to Hindus. What he's saying is that it encompasses so much that it's almost as meaningless as talking about Americanism. What does that mean? Well, it can mean a million different things. The classification of Hinduism proves useful, though, because it means you can take everything it means to be Indian, call it a religion, and therefore privatize it, right? So to be British is to be public, and to be Indian is to be private. And that's exactly why so many contemporary advocates of Hindu nationalism refuse to call Hinduism a religion, as Richard Cohen says, precisely because they want to emphasize that Hinduism is more than mere internalized beliefs. It is social, political, economic, familial in nature. And you can see these struggles going on elsewhere. In the late 19th century between Chinese nationalists and Western scholars, Chinese nationalists say Confucianism is not a religion, and Western scholars say, yes, it is. And it continues to go on under the communist government here. So I'm going to cut this story a little short. Tomoko Masusawa, in her book called The Invention of World Religions, writes, "This concept of religion as a general transcultural phenomenon, yet also as a distinct sphere in its own right, is patently groundless. It came from nowhere, and there is no credible way of demonstrating its factual and empirical substantiality." I think she's right, except for where she says it comes from nowhere. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from Europe, and then it was exported to the rest of the world. The important point here is that the religious secular distinction is not engraved in the nature of things. It's a distinction that is employed in Western or westernized societies to marginalize certain kinds of beliefs and practices and to authorize others. Which brings me to the last part of what I want to talk about, This was, if you remember from the beginning, I talked about what the myth of religious violence was. The last part of it is that, therefore, because it has this tendency to promote violence, religion should be marginalized from public power, and we should fight to defend and spread secular ideals. And so in this last part, I want to address the question, if the myth of religious violence is so prevalent, is so incoherent, why is it so prevalent, right? Whose interests is it serving? If it's so incoherent, why is it so prevalent? Let's look at the first part of this, public power in the domestic sphere. So I'm going to talk about the domestic sphere and then public policy. Well into the 20th century, religion was cited in Supreme Court cases as having a unifying social effect. Beginning in the 1940s, however, religion came to be seen as a potentially dangerous and divisive social force. So it's really remarkable what happens in basically 1940 is the dividing line. Before then, the Supreme Court cites it as a unifying influence, after that as a divisive influence. And the first Supreme Court case to invoke this, what I call the myth of religious violence, was Minersville School District versus Gobitis in 1940, which dealt with compulsory pledging of allegiance to the American flag. Justice Felix Frankfurter invoked the specter of religious wars in addressing the Jehovah's Witnesses' right to dissent from patriotic rituals. That was what was at stake. The Jehovah's Witnesses said that they shouldn't have to be forced to salute the American flag. And Frankfurter, in his decision, writes, centuries of strife over the erection of particular dogmas as exclusive or all-comprehending faiths led to the inclusion of a guarantee for religious freedom in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment sought to guard against repetition of those bitter religious struggles by prohibiting the establishment of a state religion and by securing to every sect the free exercise of its faith. Now, how do you think Frankfurter ruled in this? I mean, from this, it sounds like he protected the Jehovah's Witnesses' right to dissent, right? Wrong. He says it doesn't apply to Jehovah's Witnesses because their dissent threatens the promotion of national cohesion. We are dealing with an interest inferior to none in the hierarchy of legal values. National unity is the basis of national security. What the school authorities are really asserting is the right to awaken in this child's mind considerations as to the significance of the flag contrary to those implanted by the parent. If you're a parent, this is creepy, right? The school can force your kids against your beliefs to salute the American flag because nationalism is our primary value, right? Now, the court reversed itself 3 years later, but Frankfurter had succeeded in introducing this idea of religious violence into Supreme Court cases, and it would be invoked again and again and again after this. Now, Martin Marty discusses this case, and he cites the many instances of Jehovah's Witnesses who were attacked, beaten, tarred, castrated, imprisoned in the U.S. in the 1940s because they believed that followers of Jesus Christ should not salute a flag. They thought it was idolatry. Now, one would think that Marty would draw the obvious conclusion that zealous nationalism can cause violence. Astonishingly, he concludes, it became obvious that religion, which can pose us versus them, carries risks and can be perceived by others as dangerous. Religion can cause all kinds of trouble in the public arena. So for Marty, religion refers not to the ritual vowing of allegiance to a flag, but only to the Jehovah's Witnesses' refusal to do so, right? So the myth of religious violence is used here to draw attention away from nationalist violence and toward so-called religious violence, even though in this case the religious people were the ones suffering rather than perpetrating the violence. It was the Jehovah's Witnesses who were getting the crap beat out of them. But somehow this becomes an argument about why religion is dangerous. In the succeeding decades, the myth of religious violence then is invoked in case after case, banning school prayer, forbidding voluntary religious instruction on public school property, forbidding state aid to parochial school teachers, and so on. When the court banned school prayer in the Abingdon case in 1963, again invoking the specter of religious violence, Justice Potter Stewart dissented and warned of the establishment of a religion of secularism, he called it. The establishment of a religion of secularism. Interesting language there. And he noted the long history of government religious practice in the United States, including the fact that the Supreme Court starts every session with "God save this honorable court," right? Well, Justices Goldberg and Harlan responded to that by saying, you can draw a sharp line between patriotic invocations of God and religious invocations of God. And so they say, there is, of course, nothing in the decision reached here that is inconsistent with the fact that school children and others are officially encouraged to express love for our country by reciting historical documents such as the Declaration of Independence, which contain references to the deity, or by singing officially espoused anthems which include the composer's profession of faith in a supreme being, or with the fact that there are many manifestations in our public life of belief in God. Such patriotic or ceremonial occasions bear no true resemblance to the unquestioned religious exercise that the state has sponsored, in this instance, school prayer. Now, they don't offer any reason why patriotic invocations of God bear no true resemblance to religious invocations. But it's clear that for them, what separates religion from what's not religion is not the invocation of God, right? God can be invoked in public ceremonies without those ceremonies thereby becoming religious, as long as they express love for our country. So separating religion from non-religion depends not on the presence or absence of expressions of faith in God, but on the presence or absence of expressions of faith in the United States of America. So American nationalism is the antidote for religious divisiveness, and more specifically, to put a point on it, revulsion to killing and dying in the name of one's religion is one of the principal means by which we become convinced that killing and dying in the name of America is laudable and proper. And that brings me to my final section on foreign policy. The conventional wisdom that religion causes violence helps to justify and reinforce Western attitudes towards the non-Western world, especially Muslims, right? In post-9/11 discourse, we tell ourselves we have this peaceful, secular type of government here. Those people over there have this crazy kind of religious political system, and that's what creates all the havoc over there. They still mix religion and politics, which is dangerous. Their violence is religious, and therefore it's irrational and divisive. Our violence, on the other hand, is secular, and therefore it's peacemaking and unitive, and unfortunately sometimes we find ourselves required to bomb them into the higher rationality, right? Now, that was a joke. Sorry. Hitchens, for example, skewers religion for its violence, but he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War. And despite his attempt to draw Martin Luther King to his side, Hitchens has some very approving things to say about killing people. Some Hitchens quotes, "And I say to the Christians while I'm at it, go love your own enemies, by the way. Don't be loving mine. I think the enemies of civilization should be beaten and killed and defeated, and I don't make any apology for it." For Hitchens, the Iraq War was part of a broader war for secularism. He has an article called Bush's War for Secularism, and the game is zero-sum. It is not possible for me to say, well, you pursue your Shiite dream of a hidden imam, and I pursue my study of Thomas Paine and George Orwell, and the world is big enough for both of us. The true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee. Now, of course, the true believer he has in mind is the Muslim, right? But the message, I think, is also the case that the true believer in secularism cannot rest until the whole world has been converted to secularism by force, if necessary. And let me give you one more example of that. Fellow new atheist Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, about the violence and irrationality of religion, dramatically illustrates this double standard. In the book, Harris condemns the religious torture of witches, but he provides his own argument for torturing terrorists. And his book is charged with the conviction that the secular West cannot reason with religious people, but must deal with them by force. So he says, some propositions are so dangerous it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. Certain beliefs place their adherents beyond the reach of every peaceful means of persuasion, while inspiring them to commit acts of extraordinary violence against others. There is, in fact, no talking to some people, religious people, in other words. If they cannot be captured, and they often cannot, otherwise tolerant people may be justified in killing them in self-defense. This is what the United States attempted in Afghanistan, and it is what we and our other Western powers are bound to attempt at an even greater cost to ourselves and innocents abroad, elsewhere in the Muslim world. We will continue to spill blood in what is, at bottom, a war of ideas. Right? So his logic here is impeccable. Religious people hold these beliefs that are irrational, so you can't try to reason with them. You can only deal with them by force. So the myth of religious violence becomes a justification for the use of violence. In a chapter called The Problem with Islam, Harris writes, in our dialogue with the Muslim world, we are confronted by people who hold beliefs for which there is no rational justification and therefore cannot even be discussed. And yet these are the very beliefs that underlie many of the demands that they are likely to make upon us. This is especially a problem, he says, if such people gain access to nuclear weapons. There is little possibility of our having a Cold War with an Islamist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day, but it may be the only course of action available to us, given what Islamists believe. He goes on to say that Muslims would then likely misinterpret this act of self-defense as a genocidal crusade, thus plunging the world into nuclear holocaust. All of this is perfectly insane. Of course, I have just described a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone, and unicorns. In other words, if we have to slaughter millions through a nuclear first strike, it's the fault of the Muslims and their crazy religious beliefs. Before we get to that point, Harris continues, we must encourage civil society in Islamic society and countries, but we cannot trust them to vote it in, of course. One more quote from Harris. It seems all but certain that some form of benign dictatorship will generally be necessary to bridge the gap. But benignity is the key, and if it cannot emerge from within a state, it must be imposed from without. The means of such imposition are necessarily crude, economic isolation, military intervention, etc. But while this may seem an exceedingly arrogant doctrine to espouse, I think it appears we have no alternatives. So, Harris's book is a particularly blunt version of this type of justification, but he's by no means isolated. His book won the 2005 Penn Award for Nonfiction. It was a New York Times bestseller. It has been enthusiastically endorsed by such academic superstars as Richard Dawkins and Alan Dershowitz and Peter Singer. Peter Singer, the same one who thinks that you can't kill non-rational animals for food, but apparently non-rational Muslims is a different matter. And Harris's logic is little different from the common assumption in American foreign policy that our liberal values are right and true for every person in every society, and we will take military action if necessary to promote such values. So, to conclude, here's my argument in summary. There's no essential difference between so-called religious and secular, so there's no good reason for thinking that religious ideas and practices are more inherently prone to violence than so-called secular ideas and practices. And the idea that there is something called religion and that it is essentially prone to violence is an ideological justification for the social arrangements, and which includes violence in so-called secular orders. Now, I don't by any means wish to deny the virtues of liberalism or excuse the vices of other kinds of social orders. Here's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to level the playing field so that we do, in fact, examine the violence that can be generated by jihad or the sacrificial atonement of Christ, but we also look at the violence that can be generated by things like the invisible hand of the market, or the idea of America as universal policeman or savior, and so on, the ideologies of free markets, free elections. So put simply, my argument is that people kill for all sorts of things. Things like money and flags and oil and freedom that function as gods in people's lives. So I want to challenge the religious-secular dichotomy that causes us to turn a blind eye to liberal forms of imperialism and violence. And really, the myth of religious violence is, insofar as it creates the villains against which our social order defines itself, it's really not that much different from previous forms of imperialism that assumed that the savages over there need to be made to look more like us by military means if necessary. So I don't want to either vilify Western-style liberalism nor justify theocracy, but rather help us to see that these are not the only two choices that are out there, right? We have to stop trying to assume that Muslims need to choose between Canada or Iran. There are other possibilities. So violence feeds on the need for enemies, the need to separate us from them, and these binary ways of dividing the world make the world understandable for us but unlivable for many people. So doing away with the myth of religious violence is one way of resisting such binaries, and perhaps thereby turning some enemies into friends. Thank you. So we've got time for questions, conversation. I'd like to hear what y'all think. Yeah. I mean, if you're killing somebody in the name of an atheist ideology like Marxism, which assumes that you need to overthrow religion because it's the opium of the people, then it seems to me like you've got a kind of fanaticism in the service of an atheist ideology that really isn't thereby any different than a fanaticism in the service of a theist ideology. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way of leveling the playing field. We need to be self-critical and not kind of vilify secularists, on the other hand, and make them out. I guess the reason I'm concentrating on the idea that religion causes violence is because it's so much more common, right? I was asked to write a chapter for the Blackwell Companion to Religion and Violence, and the chapter I handed in was called "Why This Volume is a Very Bad Idea," and the editor changed the title of my talk, but the basic point is that there's going to be a Blackwell Companion to Religion and Violence, and there's never going to be a Blackwell Companion to Secularism and Violence, right? It's just part of the ideology that undergirds our social order, and so we need to examine it. But I think you're right. I mean, there's no point either in vilifying secularism. On the other hand, I think we need to be a little bit more careful, though. I mean, Pope Benedict XVI did not vilify secularism. I mean, if you look at the second half of Deus Caritas Est, it's basically a whole defense of secular social orders in the sense of secularism as in the separation of church and state. The Catholic Church has made its peace with the separation of church and state, at least since Vatican II now, and Benedict XVI is completely on board with that. He attacks relativism and the kind of militant secularism that tries to stamp out religion and that sort of thing, but he's not anti-secular forms of social order. But I take your point. I think I think we do need to be self-critical and not kind of turn this into an exercise of kind of blaming somebody else on the other side. I mean, in general, anytime you make a statement like religion causes violence, or secularism causes violence, or Islam causes violence, you've already uttered something that's probably stupid. Right? I mean, because you've taken, Islam, which is a belief system that encompasses over 1 billion people, and you've kind of labeled it as if there's one thing, and ISIS represents it. I mean, there's an interesting book called What Muslims Really Think, which is based on surveys of 50,000 Muslims from all over the world. And they found that only 7% of them would justify the 9/11 attacks. And yet, when we think about these matters, we assume that, the Muslim world is all just crazy out to get us and so on. So, anyway, thank you for that comment. Other questions, comments? Yeah, please. I think what you just said there is probably exactly right, right? We need to approach these matters with pragmatism as opposed to sloganeering. Right. Unfortunately, we're in the election cycle, and binaries get all the attention. Right. The political candidates that create enemies and demonize other people. That's what's getting the attention these days. But pragmatism, I think, is exactly right. There's not two kinds of government, and you have to choose between them. There are dozens, hundreds of different kinds of government. And in the Middle East, especially, I think we should be careful not to try to kind of cram other kinds of societies into a Western-style democracy or Western-style kind of liberal society that works for us in some ways, but may not work for them. And in the same way, I think we need to be pragmatic about within our own context. I don't think that you need to kind of like. One of the other court cases that I talked about in my book is a case, Aguilar versus Felton, in, when was it, 2002, I think, maybe. But the Supreme Court struck down the possibility of kids in New York City getting remedial education on things like math and so on a parochial school campus, because they were afraid that while kids were seeing, working on their math, they might see a crucifix in a classroom or something like that. And the myth of religious violence was used to ban this. And the Supreme Court justices who dissented says this is absurd, right? And they're right. That kind of paranoia, I think we can be a lot more flexible than we are. Yeah. Thanks. Other questions, comments, discussion? Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I tend to be really suspicious of those kinds of universal tales that everybody is going the same direction, and oh look, it just happens to be the direction that we already ended up in, right? I was in Nigeria in December and was discussing this book by a scholar, which basically argues, he says that African nations need to look like Denmark. That's where they're going, and that's basically the only path to development, is eventually to try to get to where Denmark is now. And people in Africa, they're thinking, Denmark? What the hell? I've never been to Denmark. Who are these Danish people? And so on, telling us that we need to look like them, right? It wasn't a Dane who was writing this; it was a British scholar. But I think those kinds of theories, that there's only one path to development and modernization, they tend to serve the people that are making those kinds of claims. It tends to privilege our sort of social order. And I think, gee whiz, it's a big, look around the Catholics and Culture's website and you'll see it's a big world out there, and there's all kinds of people that part of the problem with a university education is that it teaches us to think that we are universal subjects, right? We take you from, your little town in western Massachusetts, and where you learned these parochial sort of ideas, and we bring you to the university, which is universal, and we teach you to have an opinion about places that you don't know crap about, right? You know, you read a book on one place, and now suddenly you're holding forth over a beer about what ought to be done about, you know, Kosovo or Uganda or places you never heard of until a few weeks ago. You know, we do a great disservice. You know, when your commencement speaker tells you, go out and change the world, you know, give them a Bronx cheer, because I mean, the world has had enough of well-meaning middle-class Americans trying to change it, right? I mean, what we need is a little bit more humility, in other words, the kind of idea that we don't know what's best for everybody in the world. It's a big world out there, and there are a lot of people think differently than us, and that ought to be okay. You know, yeah. This is why nobody's ever going to invite me to give a commencement speech, by the way. One of the many reasons, probably. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, ISIS are bad people. I mean, these are scary people who have weird ideas that are wrong. You know, I mean, we just need to come out and say that's wrong. And that, of course, that's a concern. Yeah, I mean, I tried to gesture towards that. I mean, I've got one kind of subject that I'm dealing with, but I tried to gesture towards that right at the beginning and say that, look, I'm not one of those people who's going to say, oh, religion doesn't really cause violence, or, you know, the ISIS is not really Muslim, and that sort of thing. I'm not one of those people at all. I mean, there's some scary stuff. I mean, what I'm trying to get at, though, is the idea that there's good theology and there's bad theology, right? Whereas some people are just going to think theology is bad, right? And as a theologian, I kind of think, well, you know, yeah, there's good theology and there's bad theology, and you know, and if you're looking for, there was a group of 100, it was like 150, 120 Muslim clerics that wrote an open letter to al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. You can find it on the web in a bunch of different languages, but an open letter refuting what ISIS is doing point by point from the Quran. Right, including talking about the way they're interpreting the Quran as being kind of cherry picking. They actually, in the English translation, I don't know what it is in Arabic, but they actually use the word cherry picking from the Quran and so on. So it's, I mean, and that I think is what needs to be done. Instead of these kind of slogans about Islam or whatever, we just need to get down to the nitty-gritty and saying, this is crappy theology right here, and here's why, right? And Christians need to be doing the same thing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, interesting question. If you're going to get to a bolder, stronger statement like cause, generally the stronger the statement, the more focused the research field needs to be, right? And what I mean by that is, rather than making statements like Islam causes violence, what we probably want to get towards is saying certain forms of Wahhabist Saudi theology that has been promoted by the Saudi regime through these different kind of madrasas around the Muslim world, they can lend themselves to the promotion of violence in ways that we can demonstrate, right? And so the more you can kind of narrow in on a particular place and time like that, you know, and it's easy to do the same thing in Christianity or other things. You know, Inquisition in Spain, it's probably not as bad as the British and Dutch propaganda machine has made it sound, but still it was not good, right? Let's look at that and see what's going on there. But in order to be scientific and not just ideological, I think that's exactly what we need to do. Close empirical studies of the circumstances under which ideologies of all kinds cause violence. Right now, there are tremendous academic resources being pointed at Islam and Christianity and things like that. And there's just not a whole lot going on in terms of secular violence. It just gets a pass, right? Like there's just not going to be a Blackwell companion to secularism and violence, and that's kind of what we need to be looking at. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you. Yeah. You had a question. Yeah. Interesting. I don't know if everybody heard that, but that's a really interesting comment. The idea that besides religion, race is another one of those kind of Western constructions that gets used to categorize people in a certain sort of way as dangerous. And this comes out not only out of the colonial experience, but is still very much alive now. Yeah. Thanks for that comment. That's really interesting. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Yeah. So the question is, it's an interesting question. The question is, we've been talking about violence in terms mostly of killing. And what about other kinds of violence, like silencing people? I concentrate on killing because most of the literature on religion and violence concentrates on killing. And so I'm just kind of, I don't provide a definition of violence in the book, and some people have criticized me for that, but I just say I'm just going with the definition of violence that people who make these arguments are using. And so that's why I'm not kind of getting into to that thing. So, certainly what we would want to do in a case like Galileo is look at the actual evidence and condemn what needs condemning. Clearly this was wrong. Pope John Paul II apologized for what the church did to Galileo. What's interesting about the Galileo case, though, is that it's presented as science versus religion. Science versus theology. And in fact, what it is, I think, is good theology versus bad theology. Galileo was not only a better scientist, he was a better theologian than his opponents, and he understood how to read the Bible in such a way that science and theology doesn't conflict. And that's the story that I think it would be helpful to say. So the lessons that you draw from a case like Galileo, I don't think are lessons about religion or lessons about theology as such. And I've just been trying to kind of show how complicated this whole question of religion is. But rather you make a judgment about stupid ecclesiastical authority in this case, right? And saying that they just made they were bad theologians, and Galileo was the good theologian. And eventually, not only Galileo's science, but Galileo's theology eventually wins out, and you get these much more flexible ways of reading the scriptures. So again, kind of as specific as you can get, I think the better. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it.